Rush Hour 3 movie review. So the Rush Hour 1 and 2 came out long before I started doing regular movie reviews on my blog, but I'll just recap these briefly here. Rush Hour 1 came out when I was in college and was a huge hit with the guys I was living with. They loved this movie. And they just replayed it over and over and over again in our college apartment. So I didn't even want to see it, but I saw it plenty of times and I grew to like it. I have fond memories of it, if for no other reason than it reminds me of college and kind of laughing along in the apartment with my old college roommates and all that stuff. Rush Hour 2 came out when I was living in Japan, and I went and rented it for no other reason, just because it was a connection to my college roommates. And then I was back home for a summer, and I said, "Oh guys, did you see the new Rush Hour 2? And they were like, They had completely moved on with their lives. They were no longer interested in it. And fair enough, Rush Hour 2 wasn't as funny as the original. Rush Hour 3 I never would have seen if left to my own devices. I mean, by the time it came out, it was like 10 years after the first one. According to Wikipedia, Rush Hour 3 was trapped in development hell. But it did come out, and I actually saw this, funnily enough, in Japanese class. So while I was living in Japan, at one point in my life, I enrolled in the local university as a full-time student, studying Japanese. Did that for about 6 months, or 4 months, or I don't know. Would do that in the morning and then would work in the afternoon. Most of the other students in the class were Chinese. They'd all come over to, study Japanese at a Japanese university. There was a handful of other international students, one Vietnamese student, 2 French students, a couple Korean students. Anyway, it was the last day of class, and the teacher, we had like a free period, and the teacher asked us what they wanted to do, and the Chinese students wanted to watch a movie. I think this got chosen because they were all big fans of Jackie Chan. This wasn't the first movie they wanted to see. They wanted to see The Forbidden Kingdom, but that wasn't out yet. So the teacher got this movie, and she played it in the Japanese dub because it was Japanese class. So we watched it in the Japanese dub. Although, before doing the review, I rented it and watched it again in the English dub. Because it's an English movie, huh? I would never have watched this movie probably if left to my own, but it was interesting watching it with a group of Chinese students. Every time Jackie Chan did something amazing, they burst into applause, or they would turn to me. I was the only American in the room. They would turn to me and they said, "Isn't Jackie Chan amazing?" It just gave me a feeling for how important Jackie Chan is as an international Chinese celebrity. The opening scenes of the movie take place in New York, and it shows Chris Tucker trying to direct traffic and screwing it up horribly. Several of the Chinese students turned to me and they said, "Is America really like this?" I'm actually very used to this question. Japanese people ask me this all the time when watching an American movie. It's funny, you don't realize until you go abroad just how much Hollywood is acting as an ambassador for our country. People who have never been to America think America is like a Hollywood movie, which is scary, but it happens. But then our heroes capture a would-be assassin and bring him in for questioning, only to discover he speaks French, and then all the attention shifted to the French students. And then they go to Paris, and there's all these French stereotypes that get made of, and everyone was laughing at the 2 French students in the room. And then they get into a taxi cab, and the French taxi driver goes off on an anti-American rant about how America lost in Vietnam and are losing in Iraq. And everyone, including the Vietnamese students, turned around and looked at me. I was sitting in the back of the room to see how I was going to react to this, and I just shrugged. I mean, what can you do, huh? So, yeah, interesting experience. The review, though. It's not a bad movie at all. It's not the best movie ever made, not by a long shot, but it's a pleasant waste of time. The action sequences are surprisingly good for a cliche buddy movie. And what's more, there's plenty of action. There's very little dull moments in this movie. Chris Tucker is doing his usual Chris Tucker shtick, and it's not quite as funny as it was back in the 1990s. I think his novelty is wearing off. But it's funny enough. It's funny enough for a movie like this to keep it entertaining. The plot makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, but I don't know. You can't win them all. You have to give the plot a bit of space. A few quibbles, and maybe this is just the politically correct liberal in me being a little bit overly sensitive about kind of PC matters, so feel free to ignore this section. But there were a few things I couldn't help noticing. Despite the fact that this movie takes place in America and in Paris, Jackie Chan spends the whole movie battling other Asian thugs and an Asian femme fatale. He never once gets matched up against a white guy. Now, from what I can remember, and maybe I'm remembering this wrong, but I think it was the same way in Rush Hour 1 and 2. At the very least, it was largely that way. I wonder, do you suppose there's some sort of unwritten rule in Hollywood, or maybe even a written rule, some sort of memo going around, saying, an Asian action hero? Okay, we can do that, but make sure he only fights other Asians. We don't want him fighting white Americans. That's going to turn off the American audience. I wouldn't be surprised if there was that directive going on in making these movies. Also, the Asian femme fatale in this movie, and also there was a similar character in Rush Hour 2. Is it just me, or are the Asian women portrayed as a lot more psychotic in Hollywood than Western women? I don't know. Okay, one last little thing I'm going to complain about. Edwin Starr's famous anti-war anthem, War, What Is It Good For?, closes out this movie, which I was happy about. I'm anti-war myself. I love that song. You know, it's a message you can't hear too much of these days, especially with the war in Iraq going on when this movie came out. But what's rather strange is that just as the song is gearing up to go into the verse, it cuts off. And it cuts off very abruptly. It's not a smooth cut at all. And what's more, it's going into the ending credits. So like if there was ever a place where, you know, like if they're cutting it off because they needed to get to the next scene, that would be one thing. But they're cutting it off right during the ending credits. And because it's such a clumsy cut, and because it's such a needless cut, I wonder, I mean, if you remember from the original Rush Hour, that song was a big part of the original Rush Hour. So it's not a surprise that they bring it back. In a way, they're kind of locked into it. It's like a Rush Hour tradition at this part. But the original Rush Hour came out before the Iraq War. So how much do you want to bet Hollywood, or whichever studio was making this movie, was very concerned about seeming to take a political stance on the Iraq War? So there was probably some back and forth, and somebody said, well, it was in the original movie, we have to bring it back. And somebody said, okay, you can play a little bit of it, but you just play the chorus. Don't, because the verses is when like Edwin Starr goes into all the reasons why war is so terrible. I mean, the chorus is just like, war, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. It doesn't go into any more depth than that, but in the verses, he starts to explain some of the reasons. So somebody says, just play the chorus, cut it off before the verses. Actually, the more I talk about it, the more I'm fairly convinced that's exactly the calculation behind that strange cut. Okay, anyways, those kind of political things aside, The movie's okay. I don't know if I'd recommend it, but if it's on TV, I wouldn't not recommend it either. It's interesting enough.